And so we'd set the parameters very clearly at the outset that we're going to do 25 episodes. Then we decided it was definitely worth doing another 25, and we kind of reevaluate then. Then at 50, we're kind of like, all right, let's get it to 100. And then after 100, we were pretty well in the habit of doing it. Now we're at 190, and so we're close to 200. My podcast is not something I use to make money, and really not something I do to derive any specific outcome anymore, besides to meet cool people and learn from them. If your goal is to make money, your podcast should not be your primary vessel for doing that. Setting realistic and more narrow goals, better boundaries, better scoping. I think that's a lot of what being effective is.
Hey, what's up? Welcome to the Behind the Veins podcast. Today we are joined by Shulman. Lewis is the co-host of the Lewis and Kyle show. And in this episode, we talked about the two main archetypes of podcasting. We talked about the lessons that he learned from speaking to hundreds of entrepreneurs. And we also talked about his life advice on getting in shape and getting into the game early. Welcome to my conversation with Lewis. So today I did a little bit of research. You came from a wealth of background, growing up in California, and graduated with valedictorian, going to university, wanted to become an engineer. And in the middle of COVID, you started a podcast, and now you've been working on two startups, one on ghostwriting agency and another one on chief data officer services for marketing agencies. So let's do a little bit of your story. Like,
I had been involved in university-related entrepreneurship things and even did all sorts of kind of scrappier hustles in middle school and high school. And really it clicked for me. I'm reading a lot of books that kind of put a lot of interesting ideas in my head. That was a big part of it. And then specifically, I really enjoyed MJ DeMarco's books. And I'm just someone who likes to have a high degree of kind of control over outcomes as much as I can, at least within the areas that I can. And I find that within business, within a more traditional corporate environment, sometimes a lot of things are out of your control. In terms of maybe you think you deserve more pay, but it's not up to you if you get more pay. Whereas in a business, if you bring in more money, you can just pay yourself more. Some very simple things like that really motivated me to be in an environment I thought would be more aligned with kind of my psychology and my natural tendencies. I think being an entrepreneur is very difficult and oftentimes not very glamorous in the realities of it. I kind of think that I'm just not sure if I would be able to not be one, unfortunately. And so I think I just kind of had to make it work.
I see. And when you talked about like you were reading a lot of books, and there were a lot of people that you look up to, who were some of your heroes back then or even now?
Yeah, back then is a much easier answer. I really enjoyed MJ DeMarco's books, just kind of very dense in terms of the amount of ideas that I wasn't familiar with or that they made sense once she said them, but never thought about it in that way. He was really a big one around that time. Cal Newport was also very influential, less so in terms of entrepreneurship and more so in terms of kind of personal habits and fulfillment. So I found his work really illuminating. These days, I've enjoyed Dan Martell quite a bit. He's less, it's a very natural progression, right? I think the books that I was reading then were more about starting a business and kind of what to do in those scenarios. And now that I have a business that does well, it's more of a question of how can I do it better? And so obviously now I'm gravitating towards books that are more applicable to the specific stage that I'm in. So I really enjoy Nicholas Cole. He's big on Twitter, and Dickie Bush. Dickie hasn't written any books, but Nicholas Cole's written several books specifically about building writing themed agencies. So that's very directly related to what it is that I'm doing. And likewise, I do a lot of sales and marketing. So these books are very practical.
Cool. I also was connected to the episode you did with Danko talking about the ability to build side projects and how that it's going to direct your attention to where you're spending time consuming content, like what type of content you're going to look at. So when you talk about like searching for content you're more applicable with and you're directly using this knowledge onto building the businesses that you have control over, I think that's beautiful. That's a great connection. And now I wanted to talk a little bit about the show. the Lewis and Kyle show that you started back in March 2020. So could you walk us through a little bit of like the origin story? Like, how did you meet Kyle? How did this idea get started? How do you convince yourself to do this?
I met Kyle at a entrepreneurship contest. It's called Startup Weekend. Our school hosted it. I don't fully remember how I found out about the contest. I just maybe it's on an email list. I don't totally remember. And anyway, I found out about it and I went. Kind of like a hackathon, but not everyone there is technical. More so just building a business idea and maybe a prototype of the product or some like the core prototypes of the product. And we had met at that competition. We competed against each other and just thought it was very interesting and bright. Had a lot of shared interests. So then we went out for food later in the week. Burritos. We went to Moe's Southwest. It's a place in Tuscaloosa. There's a bunch of them in the Southeast. And we went there for food. And I think it was like raining heavily. I biked there. And Kyle had trucks. And he like gave me a ride back to my house. So I didn't have to bike back in the rain. And we hung out for a while. And we just kind of started, we realized we had a class together. We didn't know it at the time, but then we kind of realized like later in the week, we're like, hey, you're in that same class I'm in. And we just wouldn't have recognized each other beforehand. So we started hanging out and very quickly became close friends. We had then that summer participated in an entrepreneurship accelerator through that same institution and worked on an e-commerce kind of niche content website. That didn't really go anywhere. I was working a full-time internship at Mercedes-Benz in Alabama, and he was working on that project. Then after that, I kind of did a study abroad. So it didn't make sense to really continue the project. And when I came back in the spring, Kyle had a whole new friend group of like people that he thought were really interesting that he wanted me to meet, that he met during the time I was gone. And we started a dinner group together with 5 or 6 of us. We'd meet up once a week. And then a few weeks in, we kind of got bored of each other and started bringing in outside figures and guest speakers or like going to interesting like public talks together, so like lectures, and just reflecting on those events. And we kind of had this realization that we had wished we had some of these dinners recorded just because they're so interesting that we wanted to revisit certain things that we had lost from the conversation. And then in March of 2020, when we went home for spring break and we're kind of not invited back to school, we wanted to keep this kind of thing going. And kind of that previous year, Kyle and I had entertained the idea of starting a podcast. We didn't have a reason to, but now we kind of had a framework for it. So that was kind of the origins of it. And we had decided, I think it was a Matt D'Avila video that talked about the value of pre-deciding at the outset of a project how long you intend to stick with it until kind of reevaluating whether or not you should or shouldn't continue. And so we'd set the parameters very clearly at the outset that we're going to do 25 episodes of this thing before really asking any questions about, is this working? Is this worthwhile, etc. And then once we hit the 25 episode mark, which is around where you're at, you'd informed me, then we decided it was definitely worth doing another 25, and we kind of reevaluate then. Then at 50, we're kind of like, all right, let's get it to 100. And then after 100, we were pretty well in the habit of doing it. Now we're at 190, and so we're close to 200. But that's the brief origin.
I see. And it's actually really interesting. I follow a very similar path as well. At the beginning, I was doing creator dinners. So I would invite friends in my circle and also mutual friends of my friends to come out to dinner as groups of 6 to 8 people. Then the conversation was just so great, and then I wish I could have recorded them. And then I also wish I could speak to someone who lives outside my region, outside my country. So I was able to do this with this podcast as well. So 100%. So at the beginning of the first 25 episodes, what were the most challenging parts of it?
Scheduling. It's always the hardest part, the scheduling. I think some of the technical stuff was fairly easy to figure out. The editing, right? Those problems were kind of small in retrospect. The effort required to do the editing was minimal in terms of as compared to the enthusiasm that I had to do it because of my energy for the project. That's in some ways over time become one of the more difficult pieces, has been delegating the post-production process. But I think that speaks more to either my budget for the project or my skills in delegation than it does into how hard it truly is to actually delegate post-production. I think I've just struggled with that for I could just commit to solving that problem. And sometimes things cost more than you would like them to. And probably that's the reason why I still have that issue. But otherwise, the interviews themselves were easy to conduct. Like, we were already good enough at having a conversation by our metric in terms of like, did the guest feel like this was a total waste of their time or not? Like, did they, as long as the guest like at the end seemed like they had a nice time and we had a good time, we felt good about it. And as long as we got the episode out and it sounded all right, we felt good about it. It was very intrinsically motivated from the outset. So I think that was it. I mean, really just scheduling is just a nightmare. Still is.
What are some of the key advantages and skills that you and Kyle bring to the table, and how are they complementary?
In terms of the podcast?
Yeah, what is each person's role in the podcast, simply speaking?
What do you say, then or now?
We can do both. So start with then.
Mm-hmm. I think at the beginning, Kyle was much better than I was at networking, for sure. And I learned a lot of what I've learned about networking online and offline from Kyle. He was just good at finding he was just good at ending up in interesting rooms where he'd meet interesting people. And he's also just very intensely curious, still more so than I am. I've kind of lost some of that intense curiosity in favor of practically being motivated to solve the problems in front of me. And that's very seasonal, right? When I have a hyper clear goal, it's a big blessing, because really anything that's not unblocking myself from taking the next step towards that goal becomes less and less interesting. At the beginning of the podcast, when I didn't have much of a goal besides to publish the episodes, right? Like, anything interesting was interesting. Or I wanted to figure out what that goal should be. So acquiring information about any, again, I'll use the word interesting topic, was exciting. I think we've both have different areas of expertise, which helps on an interview where if two experts, and experts are relative terms, right? But if two people who are knowledgeable about a subject are talking about it, they're going to tend to skip all the fluff and go straight into like a really detailed conversation that might bore someone who has no context. Whereas having that third person who has a different level of experience about that topic is good. I think Kyle also at the beginning, well, to this day, is still just more emotionally aware than I am, and always asked more interesting questions about the person and their emotional journey. Like I said, I'm very I've treated the podcast maybe too pragmatically, maybe not, but Kyle will always come in and be like, that must have been like really hard. And like the person just like their entire demeanor changes. That was a hard point in my life. And they tell the story they haven't told in a long time, and they feel like relieved, and he's like helping them in a therapeutic way. And then I'm like 2 minutes later, so what was the most effective thing for making the most money? Not really that directly, right? But like that's how the question, I guess, comes across. And so I think in terms of building relationships with the guests, Kyle was really effective in terms of just making the conversation enjoyable and rewarding for them.
We can see like the pragmatic side of you, and his emotional awareness part of Kyle really blends in together really well, because I feel like what you can do to the team is really bring up the consistency, the discipline of continue doing the podcast, and at the same time like being very clear on the problem that you're trying to solve, goal of the podcast, the points you want to cover in the podcast, where Kyle is the person who's trying to, like, as you mentioned, be in an interesting room to have form connections with like interesting guests that could be prospects of the podcast. So let's say going into the podcast, now it has been like 190 episodes, and you started back in 2020 March. It's been over 4 years. What are some of the key takeaways as a creator? So
I think podcasting businesses were created because people wanted to make money. Like, as a tool, like as a structure for coordinating human effort and like understanding entities in society, businesses exist to make money. That's why people start businesses. People start nonprofits to like do whatever they start nonprofits to do. They start schools to start whatever schools are supposed to do, etc. So podcasts were not created as a medium to make money. Same thing, books. Right? As a society, as a civilization, we created books for the idea of like transferring knowledge. Again, there are some books that have gone on to make the authors tons of money, but as a whole, the reason books exist was to either tell stories or to transfer knowledge. So I think it's important to think about podcasts in the same way. Like, why were podcasts created? As a civilization, why did we invent podcasts? And I think it's to transfer audio over the internet, streamable audio. That's pretty much it. And usually, like, why do people listen to podcasts? It's usually to either be entertained or to learn something, kind of similar as books, right? To learn something practical or to be entertained. Those are really like the two main reasons. And with that in mind, if your goal is to make money, your podcast should not be your primary vessel for doing that. I think that is just not what it's designed for. Same thing, right? Like social media, the point of social media is usually to like connect with people or to entertain people, et cetera, et cetera. It's not to make money. So if you go in playing that game for that reason, you're going to have a bad time. If instead your goal is to use a podcast like you've done to connect with people and to have a platform to explore your interests and to explore curiosities and to meet interesting people, and or from the listener's perspective, if there is a topic where you're genuinely very knowledgeable about the topic or the problem, and then instead your goal is, I want an efficient way to share this knowledge with this group of people who have this thing in common, then you are really setting yourself up for success. I think that oftentimes you'll hear this problem, or you'll hear people complain, podcasting has a deliverability problem, or not, I'm sorry, a discoverability problem. And I think that's not true. I think if I asked you to go find my podcast and I told you what it was called, you would have no problem discovering it. I think that podcasters have a problem understanding marketing, and not just marketing, but product. Like, people can find your podcast. If your podcast is exceptional, people are going to share your podcast and it's going to grow. But if your podcast is average, if it is undifferentiated, there's no reason for you to expect anything to happen. The same way, if you like open up a store next to Walmart selling something they have at Walmart, like there's no reason for them to change their behavior and find you and stay with you instead. Like, my podcast has been discovered so many times, like 100,000 plus, maybe 1 million. I've maybe had 1 million impressions at least, where someone has the opportunity for someone to become a listener to my podcast has happened. They've seen my thumbnail on YouTube, they've seen the title of an episode, they've heard a snippet, they heard a clip. Like, I've had at least 1 million impressions, probably close to like 20, where I've had an opportunity to make someone aware that I exist as a podcaster. So there's no discoverability problem. Is my podcast unique enough where it's resonating with these people, where they actually are going to choose to listen to it because it's a unique opportunity that's differentiated, unique educational opportunity, unique entertainment opportunity, either one. And also, when they've listened to it, did I provide enough value to them and enough of a promise of future value where they're going to come back? So I think you have to be hyper clear on what you're hoping to get out the other side of putting your life effort into this thing we call podcasting. And you need to ask yourself, is this something that goes with the tide, as in like is a natural use of the system? Am I using the tool correctly, or am I using the tool incorrectly and hoping that something unlikely happens?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Especially at the beginning when you talk about like, is your goal to make money? If it is, then podcast should never be your primary platform. And also, if your goal is not to make money, is to be connected with people, to explore your interests, then yeah, like Spotify podcasting could be your primary platform, and you just have to know the whys, like the whys you started your podcast or even any kind of social media channels. And you talked about, and I think there's a lot to unpack there. I want to start with like the audience, the marketing part. You said a lot of podcasters have problems marketing their podcast to people, and there isn't necessarily like a discovery problem on the platform or just podcasting in nature. If people want to find it, they will find it. I am more curious about the idea of like the who, right? Who are your audience? Who are your ideal customer profile? If you say it that way, like how would you describe your audience
For my podcast?
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to come full circle here. when you have a business, then you do have an ideal customer, right? You can describe that person clearly and you can explain what problem they have, and or what value that what you're making is going to create for them. So you're confident they're going to purchase from you or interact with you in some beneficial way to you and to them, obviously, because your solution or product solves their problem. With my podcast is not something I use to make money, and really not something I do to derive any specific outcome anymore, besides to meet cool people and learn from them. The podcast, while there's still an added benefit of, let's say I want to make it so if I know someone's going to search a certain phrase on Google, I'll probably be able to rank number 1 for that. Like they're like, who's this Louis Shulman guy? What are his newsletters? If I like maybe put something on my podcast that's like Louis Shulman newsletters, and they watch that, they're going to see like, oh wow, he like knows a lot. Look at him interviewing this newsletter expert. He's like clearly well connected in the space. That's great. But otherwise, I have no target listener at present. I did, and that's dangerous. That is a very dangerous thing to say, and that is not an excuse to someone listening to this to say, I can continue putting off having an answer to that question. Because if your goal is to make your podcast grow in any way and like have any specific success besides just you enjoying it, then you should not be happy with having no answer to that question. For me, the podcast is a passion project through and through. It's tremendously beneficial. I've met a lot of amazing people from it. I've learned a lot of great things, and it's maybe contributed in some non-attributable ways to various good outcomes that I've had in business. But for the most part, at this point in time, it's just me trying to learn and talk to people when I enjoy it. I can tell you all about who my business's ideal customers are, because that is essential, right? Because I am gambling, I'm wagering that this business is going to be successful. That's why I'm not looking for jobs. That's why I'm paying myself. That's why I'm paying employees, because I believe it. And so you want something to be financially successful and have specific like quantitative outcomes. You cannot get away with not having an answer to that question whatsoever.
I think the idea with not having a niche, it's fine, especially when the platform that you're building, it's mostly self-serving. And you recording these podcasts to be shareable with the audience, whoever wants to listen, right?
Exactly.
So it also resonates with me when I think about like just like Danko as a person as well. I just keep talking about Danko. He was talking about like, I am the niche. Like my personality is the niche. Like my audience is a group of people who come from various backgrounds, different age, different psychographics, demographics, who might have shared 1 or 2 shared values as me, and they enjoy the conversations that I have or the conversations that I facilitated. So they come back for me for this reason. But you don't have anything to sell, I think it becomes less existential, and you're also not monetizing it. It becomes a lot less existential. And the most important part of the podcast is like, it's the guest having a good experience. Am I getting anything out of it? And that's it. Like, does that resonate?
Oftentimes I fall back on, it's not a perfect mental model, but I think it's a good one, that nothing is new. Very few things are new, right? Human psychology especially is very old and the same as always. And so are a lot of dynamics in the market. It's like people trying to do creative pursuits out of passion. That is not a new thing. The fact that it's on the internet, that's new. And that if you distribute it well, it's new. And that for a lot of people, you do accidentally or on purpose, find something that works. Like you are lucky or fortunate or strategic, whatever it is, and you are able to line up the variables where it's just easy. But people have made a living as artists and creatives for a long time. It's just now maybe 20 to 50 times easier, 100 times easier, I don't know. But for most of human history, or most of, let's say, modern industrial human history, this has existed as an option where you can just like, you didn't have distribution like you had before. You didn't have these like easy to sell products like you had before. So it's a lot more accessible for a lot of people. But same as always, like unless you had a really good your business fundamentals, unless you're like you have a really unique personality like Dan, right? And you have a really unique story, like there's no reason to believe that your personality alone is going to propel you to success, unless you also have everything else that you need.
So that is kind of alluding to the point where we talk about like what's behind you, what's behind the brand, like what gives you the authority, why people should listen to you. So for example, like everyone could, as you mentioned, everyone could post articles, blogs, podcasts, videos online. And let's say we were talking about like how to build startups. The message is received very differently if it was written by someone who is a serial entrepreneur who founded multiple startups and have exited versus someone who is never have never built a startup before. So my question is to you, like, when have you ever felt some level imposter syndromes when you're building the podcast?
I think that anyone's qualified to be an interviewer completely. It's all in the framing of the question, and I don't want to sound like too much like a lawyer when saying that and kind of being cute with like words, but it is genuinely in the framing of the headline and the framing of the question. So I'm never going to feel imposter syndrome to write 5 things I learned from interviewing these people, right? That's true. Those are 5 things I learned from interviewing these people. If those are absolutely correct, that's another thing, right? But I could be like, I had these 5 conversations and these 5 ideas stuck out to me as interesting. Same thing with like how I've changed because I've been a podcaster, right? So I've put out very, very few instructional videos on my YouTube channel where it's me giving advice about a thing. I have put out a couple articles like on my Substack back in 2020, 2021 that I do look back on and I'm like, I knew very little then about some of these things. Oh well. But I think that's kind of I benefited from writing these articles. I learned a lot, it clarified my thinking, it was helpful. And we often don't know what we don't know. I don't know if I feel that way I think I've learned to avoid it by staying in my lane, like speaking to what I'm qualified to speak to, and then making it really clear, like, I don't know, this might be something I don't have experience to speak to. So I think imposter syndrome, it depends if it's appropriate or inappropriate in terms of if you are speaking about something. So I've never felt like, who am I to be interviewing this person, right? I think a lot of people get at that, like, oh, that's not imposter. Oh, I guess that's also imposter syndrome. Like, am I worthy of interviewing this person right now? Am I worthy of having this conversation? Am I worthy of these outcomes? That's definitely a thing that's real that I fortunately haven't struggled too much with. But in terms of, you just need to frame is the key word, what you're doing as like honest.
Yep.
If you are being dishonest, then you're going to feel like an imposter. But if what you're doing is honest, like you said, like, I am in this position, this is who I am, this is where I'm at, this is what I'm doing. I never really pretended to be somewhere I didn't feel like was true. And like, even when I wrote those like advice, those kind of advice style articles that maybe I kind of look at a bit more cringy now, I still at the time thought I knew what I was talking about.
That makes sense. And the idea with avoiding going to areas that you're not familiar with, like that could save you a lot of those moments. And also the idea of framing, whether if it's a question, the headline, the title, the thumbnails. I think that is very important because that is going to like set an expectation for the people who are reading or viewing or listening to this. So I think that's helpful. Now I wanted to move on like the idea of translating the knowledge to what you're doing on the 2 businesses that you have. And I think you previously already mentioned that the platform, it's quite distinct from the businesses. It's not really like a funnel. You're not like trying to like drive audience and move them from podcasts to your businesses. It's more like the podcast is your training ground. It's more like your platform to connect with people that you look up to learn from entrepreneurs and use those learnings in your businesses. So let's talk about like when you run 2 businesses simultaneously with the podcast, like how do you juggle between all of them?
I am not alone. That's always the answer to that question. I don't know if it's always the answer, but it's frequently the answer to that question. Is I have teams, partners. It's awesome. I have Sean as my business partner. at Orbit Metrics, and Ethan is also a business partner at both companies. Sean is basically extremely autonomous. We're all quite autonomous in our lanes. And the way our lanes are carved out as of now is that Sean pretty much does all of the decision making and overseeing of the fulfillment for Orbit Metrics. So for a long time, I brought in a lot of the customers, and now there's a pretty healthy stream of kind of referrals and repeat business. And Sean's just really in charge of keeping everybody happy and also facilitating the flow of new deals from those channel partnerships that we've established. We do a lot to grow it by continuing to like expand our offerings and learn new skills. But for the most part, that's a system that has been established where I'm no longer necessary in the growth of it. And then the podcast, I am not as consistent with as I've been, right? Because I am in the point where I feel like practically there's a lot of knowledge in my head that I've already accumulated that I haven't fully
applied,
exhausted or applied. Exactly. And because I haven't done that yet, like I don't want to keep kind of accumulating more debt, like reading yet another book that is going to be more stuff I just need to see through the ideas that I've been taught, that I know are good, that are working, and I just need to take them to the finish line before I cram more nonsense in my head. So what I've been reading personally is more just like fiction and biographies. So let me just like entertain myself and read something interesting, but not like as directed. So the podcast, I have this year maybe recorded 1 or 2 episodes for my show. And then I've just been releasing. I recorded so many last fall that I'm still releasing. And I have a team of editors that do vast majority of post-production. And then I have a friend of mine who I pay to also help with some of the post-production stuff. So it's also kind of a system that's fairly well maintained. And then the majority of my interviews come to me from referrals as well, with partnerships with PR companies that are trying to get exposure for some of their clients. Then likewise, right, I have a lot of credibility from having done this so long that if there's someone that I just happen to like encounter on the internet that I find interesting and I invite them on the show, the amount of effort required. I think that a big part of what business is being able to do the same thing with less and less effort over time. And so for me, being able to schedule, record, publish, promote a podcast with less and less effort is the maturity of the system. So that's also a mature system at this point. So the only immature system, or the least mature system, if you will, is Inbox Ghosts, which is actually potentially in some other ways the most mature system because it's like it's my 3rd time building one of these, or 5th time or 10th. I've lost count, but it's my most recent one. So it's also the one I'm doing the best job at because it's like the one I know the most about or I've like had the most experience before starting. But that's where all of my time goes, is to building systems at Inbox Ghosts to allow that to continue to thrive and scale into like the largest, best thing I've done yet. And what that means for me, I have still mostly the hat of sales and marketing and product, figuring out our main offer and how we want to expand the offer, but mostly as well, just getting more clients for our existing offer, which is at present, April 2024. We will write your weekly newsletter for you, done for you. That's the main offer. If you have one, we'll take it over. If you don't have one, we'll start it. And that's the offer. I'm trying to get a lot of clients for that offer and build the systems where it's not just me knocking on doors. It's something a bit more scalable for those coming in. So that is what I'm doing in terms of translating and applying knowledge on the podcast. A million sub lessons I could dive into, but I'll leave it there for now.
Absolutely. If you have to like plot a chart on like your time spent on like different ventures that you've been on, it's always been like at the beginning it's been very like high, very like hands-on to build sales, build marketing, build processes, build operation from scratch. And as slowly time goes, you're able to build like leverage, as in like the way to push maturity of the business by having more people, training them to take on some parts of your job, so then the business itself can scale, can go beyond just like one person. I'm curious between let's say building Inbox Ghost, because you're spending a lot of time on it today, and the early periods, or just throughout, like when you're building the Lewis and Kyle show, do you see any like similarities and differences between pursuing a business and pursuing a podcast?
I think I've just gotten better and better at setting realistic and more narrow goals, better boundaries, better scoping. I think that's a lot of what being effective is just scoping, right? It's like, do you understand how long work takes to do? Do you understand, did you assign the right amount of time to it? Like, did you, if you will, set boundaries and parameters around what you're doing well at the outset? And I think that's a lot of like what like succeeding is just, or that's a big component skill of succeeding, is getting better and better at scoping and forecasting what's going to happen. That's why like this is now proper imposter syndrome territory. This is more so conjecture, right? But like Elon, someone like a massive entrepreneur like Elon, who's built several large companies, knows what it takes to build another one. So it's like, oh, that thing usually takes about a year and this much money and this many people if it's roughly this level of difficulty. I've seen that before, so you come to me with this idea. Sounds about right. So I have the tiniest fraction of that experience and judgment, intuition within the scales I've operated in, right? If someone asks me, how hard is it going to be to start a podcast and do 50 episodes? I'm going to be able to give them a better answer in terms of like, you should set aside this many thousands of dollars, this many hours per week, distributed in this way. That's what it's going to look like. And you're like, oh, wow. So similarities, it's like set a goal, set a bounded goal, right? So we set some revenue numbers. We're like, if we don't hit this number within this timeline, maybe we should reconsider. If we don't hit this many clients within this timeline, if we have this churn within this, we should reconsider. If like we get this much traffic on our landing page, it's just setting, again, the same process of we have a goal, we have a concept, and let's set a finite interval of time to give a certain amount of enthusiasm and effort towards it, and then constrain the conditions under which we continue, reevaluate, pivot, etc. The biggest difference is that the thesis around Inbox Ghosts is that this problem exists that people are willing to pay to solve. Whereas the podcast was, I'm Lewis and I want to interview people and publish it, and I'm Kyle and I want to interview people and publish it. Let's interview people and publish it, right? We didn't want to write newsletters for businesses the way that myself and Kyle wanted to publish podcasts. That is a desire that we had. I love newsletters. I think they're awesome. I think that definitely is like I love reading a good newsletter. That played a role in this business. But for the most part, like the desire wasn't to write newsletters for businesses. The desire was to help businesses grow using the tool of email. Like, I know these businesses would be making more money if only someone was writing a newsletter for them. So I want to deliver that solution to them. And so that's why the success in quantitative outcome terms has been very different for Inbox Ghosts versus the podcast.
And now I wanted to talk about the earlier questions I asked before. After doing about 190 episodes with entrepreneurs and creators and authors, the people that you look up to, what are some of the biggest like not like life changing, but like what are some of the ideas that like change your perspectives?
In the terms of things that are practical and less so just telling my own story, I think not almost everyone, a outrageously high percentage of guests that I've worked with, interviewed, have had some form of continued formal education or mentorship or coaching or therapy. Some thing that they are a part of for the sole reason of being better that is not self-directed. Some external thing that pushes them to improve. I think that is like across the board consistently a thing. So it could be a business coach, it could be a mastermind, it could be higher education, it could be a therapist, but something that they're doing with commitment and structure for the sake of continuing to hone their skills and like sharpen themselves. That is just like common pattern number one. There's some very basic things that all sorts of people talk about, like exercise and physical health. There's no understating that. I think on the hierarchy, if this is even the right metaphor of like, or maybe like the rings of like human performance, there's the innermost ring and the outermost ring. I think the at the innermost ring, we are animals and need to like be well fed and have healthy hearts and healthy brains. And so fixing that's going to have a higher return. Just showing up every day energetic is going to make a bigger impact than having the best idea, sort of. Secondarily, there's like market. There's how can you interact with the market well, and how can you manage yourself well. And I think maybe those are the two different circles, and you take the sum, or like maybe you multiply the circles together in terms of like the score. If anyone's able to trace this analogy still, the market, the most important thing, yeah, because if you do have a great problem and a great market and a great willingness to pay and a great solution, it doesn't matter if you feel like shit, have no energy. As long as you got your website up and the fulfillment's automated, you're going to crush the guy who's happy doing something no one cares about. So that's why like there's the two circles, and the other circle multiplies it to 0 if there's no value in the product. So there's how do you make yourself more effective, and how do you make like your offering more appealing to the market. And if I kind of think about it in those two categories, those are just a couple of the tips that stand out. Is like take care of yourself to be your best self, because you're going to make your best decisions, have your best judgment, have your best ideas. And then also all of that cancels to 0 if the fundamentals aren't there in the business. And I keep saying the fundamentals, like it's some shared thing that everyone understands. But I would define the fundamentals for most businesses, right? There's a lot of different ways to succeed in business, but the new iPhone doesn't solve a problem necessarily. But in service businesses, it's mostly about solving a problem or adding a particular type of value. So either have some specific new opportunity, new form of value that people want, or you solve a problem. This is a problem. People can articulate what the problem is. And you say, what if you didn't have that problem anymore? What would that be worth to you? They say it would be worth a lot. So you have one of those two things and you're feeling great. A bunch of strategies and tactics, hiring coaches, having accountability partners, joining masterminds. Those are some ones that are top of mind.
Yeah, so I want to throw this out there. Like, I think for most people, therapy or like coaching are not something that is super accessible for most of the people. And when I think about some kind of structured learning, right, you frame it as, would you consider like building projects like inbox goals or orbit metrics as part of the structure learning?
I mean, I think it's the only structure I have right now. I have 7 recurring meetings a week, and that's it. So that's like 8 hours of my week blocked off on my calendar. That's it. That's not a lot of structure. That is so little structure. It's too little. I think that's why 75 Hard helps so many people. Freedom's amazing. Just a lot of people don't know how to use it effectively, myself included. It's a skill to like not just be a sack of like garbage because of all this freedom and just sleep in and have no discipline, etc. So that helps having a project, but like having a schedule on top of it, or having an office that you go to and holding yourself to some hours. Like the structure is tremendously helpful. And I've moved a lot. I just moved to New York, and I'm going to then go home for the summer to visit my family. And so like kind of the absence of structure, I think definitely harms my performance from time to time. And so that's something I'm working on, is staying somewhere longer term. But yeah, those 8 hours of meeting with my business partners every week in various meetings that we host, that is like the only form of structured improvement that I have, is getting feedback from them as to what they think I could have done better in the past week. But I still would like something additional and someone with a third perspective than the business. But yeah, doing a self-paced course and committing to actually finishing, that could work. Going to a gym, even if I just like got back into like a jiu-jitsu or a CrossFit or something, where like you're going somewhere and someone is like telling you to improve in specific ways, I think that's very important to the soul.
To sort of starting to close it off, like if you could leave a message to, let's say Lewis back in university, still at Mercedes-Benz, working in his internship, what would that message be?
So that was the summer. I would have said I still don't do MMA consistently, but because I just keep getting hurt doing it. But I'd say do some MMA. I think that's a good idea. If I wasn't, I might have been vegetarian at that time. I don't remember. But if I was, I'd say stop. I think that's objectively a terrible decision. Like I've made every decision I've made in the past 5 years pales in comparison to the benefits of stopping being a vegetarian. That was outright one of the worst, stupidest things I've ever done, ever, objectively. So stop being vegan, stop being vegetarian. do some MMA. I'm still torn, honestly, on the counterfactual. If like I was off Twitter completely for most of college, off of almost all social media entirely for almost all of college. I got on Instagram because I wanted to promote the podcast. I got on Twitter before I started the podcast. But point being, I'm still not sure the counterfactual if I just would have been better off completely staying offline those platforms and just building my audience through SEO and YouTube and then having no social presence. I still might consider, I don't know the counterfactual there. I don't. But I am tempted. Like the past 2 weeks, I've used Twitter for like 11 minutes, which is the lowest it's been in so long. And I think I've been so outrageously higher output from that. It's ridiculous. I'm still very, and as I said, I was reading books like Cal Newport. So I might have said like, there will come temptations to get on social media. Like I've gotten some of my customers from Twitter for the business, but not really. Most of them have come from outreach, partnerships, relationships, conferences, serendipity. So I'm very torn on like, if I would just say outright, just don't get sucked into social media, build a path without it, because there are still plenty of good life paths without it. I'm not sure. I still, I like where I'm at. So I don't really feel much of a need to like say, do much differently. Besides just like, don't use Twitter that much. It destroys your brain. And never have the social media apps on your phone. And like hire coaches, do MMA, run a lot, like never get out of good cardio shape. Same. And then, yeah, I didn't drop out. I don't know if it would have really benefited from dropping out. I think that's fine. So when I graduated in May of 2021, and then I would like kind of work that whole summer working on my creator projects, if you will, podcast, newsletter, etc., and trying to start a business, but I didn't really have any urgency or any idea of what to start. So I just decided to get a job working in crypto. I think I would have just said to like get a job sooner because it just gets you in the game. You just don't want to not be in the game. And in my opinion, having projects that don't make money is not being in the game. Like having a client is in the game because then you're playing the game of delegate this client work to someone else, get a second client, raise his rates, offer more to him, improve the service. Then you're in the game. The game is like be involved, be a party in an economic transaction as soon as possible, is how I would say it. Like I was not, for 4 months when I graduated, I was not a party in any economic transactions. I was publishing a podcast, sure. That's not, there's no transfer of dollars. Even a job is a transfer of dollars because they're saying employing you is worth this many dollars per month. It's worth it for us to pay you. Here's a weekly paycheck for what you did. You are now in an economic transaction. Like, then you're in the game. Then you can play the game of, I can do this better one. I can do better at this job. Maybe they'll pay me more. I can tell this other company that does this thing, look, I have this experience here. Let me go there. But when you're not involved in an economic transaction, you're not in the game. So stay in shape, get in the game.
Stay in shape, get in the game. Got it. And yeah, I think that wraps up with this podcast. And again, Lewis, thank you so much for taking the time to record this. I've learned a ton about entrepreneurship, advice, life advice, and podcasting. So appreciate you.
Thank you so much, Alex. Appreciate it.
So that is it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. All the links and resources will be shared in the descriptions. And if you'd like to support the podcast, please leave us a 5-star rating on whichever platform that you're on. It would help us a ton to reach new audiences. Thank you so much for listening. And again, I see you in the next one.